As I've stated before, and please apply this disclaimer to all my videos, remarks here are based upon my knowledge of evidentiary fact and are not to be construed as legal advice. I am not a legal practitioner, confining myself to the area of lawful behaviour as defined by natural or common law and the English or British Constitution of the Commonwealth. I have no contact with the legal profession or its various offices or instruments of enforcement, other than those with which I am compelled by threat or application of violence to interact. In such cases, I do so only under duress, because almost all of their demands seek to coerce me into acting unlawfully or in opposition to constitutional law as defined in the preceding sentences. By making plain that I act under duress in such circumstances, I absolve myself from future liability in any properly constituted court of record, from any accusations of complicity in treason, organised or otherwise. At the end of this video, it will remain your choice to decide whether to comply with constitutional law or with the concocted legalism which currently holds sway by means of armed coercion in our current system of governance. Most have declined to adopt the former choice until now, but hopefully what is said here will persuade many more to seriously rethink their attitudes and actions. This talk is titled Your Role in the Epstein Files, which will probably mystify many viewers. There are indeed many people named in the Epstein Files, but most of them are either celebrities, people of high rank in society, or simply those with enough money to exercise some influence in the circles encompassing membership in what most people would class as deplorable company. Tales of organised and systematic paedophilia, corruption of all types, with allegations of even more horrific crimes, seem to form the bulk of allegations filling such of the files as have currently been released for scrutiny. The question arising in most viewers' minds would be, well, what has this to do with me? I'm not involved in any way with this disgusting scenario. But you are, you see. It's an ancient principle in law, which even the corrupt system now in place utilises, that to be aware of something untoward happening and to fail to resist it, or even to simply remain silent, is to give tacit consent. We're all familiar with this concept as it applies, for example, to cases of child abuse, whereby if knowing of it and failing to report it makes us culpable under the law. Anyone disagree with that? No? Good. Let's move on. We're discussing a principle here, aren't we? It's not as if this principle applies to some laws and actions and not to others, is it? The problem for fence sitters is that in nature we're answerable not just for what we do, but also for what we don't do. In your heart of hearts, you know this. It's just that when we're offered the chance to offload some of life's more difficult tasks, such as the administration of justice, it's so easy to heave a mental sigh of relief that someone else is going to lift that burden from us, isn't it? But it's absolutely vital that we keep our eye on those we entrust with such responsibilities. Since we can't watch every single action officers undertake, either publicly or in their private lives, it's essential that the system under which they operate must have very strict guidelines. Failure to institute those will lead to progressively greater infringements of both natural and legislative boundaries. Why? I mentioned before that one of the few lessons that stuck with me from my school days was when a teacher once said that the true test of a person's character was what they would do if they knew they would never be found out. I think it's fair to surmise that most of the population, and I don't exclude myself from this, lest anyone think I'm sounding a bit preachy, would find some temptations very difficult to resist under such circumstances. What those temptations would be obviously vary individually depending on personal predilections and weaknesses. It's just human nature, isn't it? And there's one temptation that it can be argued subsumes all others, which is power or the exercise thereof. With power, one can indulge in whatever predilection one chooses. In many cases, not even money is necessary. The simple exercise of influence can compel or induce almost any desirable type of behaviour from an intended victim. The most visible example of this in action is in politics, where it frequently becomes apparent that proposed policies are amended because of some hidden consideration. But even in this arena, it must be assumed that lobby groups exercise enormous influence, which often crosses party lines. And how do lobbies operate? By the dangling of money or the exercise of power that will bring money into the equation. Money is latent or stored power. It can be easily converted into whatever commodity or outcome is desired. For who amongst us, especially the ultra-rich plutocrat, is ever satisfied with the amount of money they have? And which group exerts the greatest degree of influence over the greatest amount of money, if not bankers? Now it's time for a bit of history to illustrate the importance of this principle and why you're involved in the Epstein Files, even if you don't see it yet. In 1688-89, what is termed the Glorious Revolution occurred in Great Britain. It wasn't, in fact, a glorious revolution. It was a coup whereby a foreign prince was installed upon the throne in England with the aid of a group of European, basically Dutch bankers, and several corrupt members of the English aristocracy and establishment figures. They changed the coronation oath to ensure that future monarchs in England made themselves subservient to Parliament and listed a so-called Bill of Rights, never actually enacted, which is why it remains a bill, not an act. To have fully enacted it would have been an open admission of constitutional treason under Magna Carta 1215. The term Glorious Revolution, when you think about it, smacks of the sort of titles other totalitarian states produce for their advents. It could easily be applied to the Bolshevik or Maoist revolutions, could it not? And it has the same propagandist aim as those other titles. Within a few years, in 1694, the Bank of England was created and the City of London became the personal fiefdom of those banking affiliates. This was about 80 years before the American colonies rebelled and fought their war of independence, which on the face of it they won. In fact, the British bankers never really accepted American independence and have persisted through the centuries to undermine and hopefully bring about the return of English dominance over American financial hegemony. But that's a side issue here, a topic for another video. My point here is that the British Parliament, having been suborned by the London-based bankers, now had carte blanche to proceed with whatever nefarious plans they could dream up. This they did, and have spent the last 330 odd years dominating the world, first militarily, their only setback being the apparent loss of the American colonies, and throughout the period by exercising global financial control. The creation of the current states in the Middle East, including Israel, which were ultimately down to Britain, deciding where the new lines on the map were going to be drawn, which they did according to what they perceived would further their own interests, irrespective of the systemic conflicts that would ensue by forcing into the same political boundaries tribes and religious and ethnic groups which previously had kept themselves separate from each other. The American Republic was, despite the warnings and fears of George Washington, torn almost immediately into two competing factions, with financial philosophical schools led by Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson favoured a smaller government with local banks and communities issuing currencies based on precious metals, gold and silver, especially silver, since the latter was more available to the average dweller. Hamilton, conversely, wanted a national bank, since he believed that such would enable the United States to eventually become a major world power because of its size and abundant resources, coupled with a growing industrial productive capacity. Hamilton's view eventually won out, despite being resisted strenuously by several presidents who feared the control of the government eventually passing into the hands of financiers. Andrew Jackson was successful in preventing this central bank for many decades, but the financiers persisted, when necessary killing those presidents who followed Jackson's thinking, namely Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy. The latter was removed because despite the nominal central bank, the Federal Reserve, having been finally established in 1913, he was determined to undo the malign influence it exerted over the Republic. The point of relating briefly the machinations of these two financial powerhouses is to illustrate what happens whenever the general populace ignores the chicaneries of their politicians and allows them unfettered exercise of money and power. Despite the British and American financial cabals apparently sometimes opposing each other and at other times appearing to act in concert, the goal of both is to establish totalitarian control over their respective spheres. It's in the nature of such parasitic entities, which clearly produce nothing themselves, but simply extract by political power as much as possible of the fruits of the labour of their constituents, to eventually either reside in an uneasy equilibrium within the overall domain, or to eventually attempt to consume their rivals in an ultimate struggle for total global dominance. Replicating, in fact, the modus operandi of criminal gangs such as mafias. Everywhere such entities exist. The only difference is that governments are more organised in their crimes, though, of course, they're quite willing to employ sections of non-government criminal elements when it suits to further their aims. It follows, when thought about objectively, that if the concept of accountability is thrust far enough to one side, with the ruling class being granted effective immunity from prosecution, that eventually its protagonists will presume that they may do exactly as they wish and do so without having to face the consequences. This immunity consists first in protecting parliamentarians from the consequences of enacting unconstitutional legislation, rendering them only liable to prosecution for personal offences against statutory crimes, but allowing free rein in infringing their fellow humans' rights under the canopy of legislation. The secondary line of defence is a complicit judiciary working hand in glove with the Parliament and having this unholy alliance supported by armed forces and constabulary, only too willing to preserve their own privileges of exercising violence in preserving the status quo. Imagine as a mental exercise that we have suddenly been granted a clean slate, with none of the staggering weight of centuries of statutes, case law judgments, and judges exercising unlawful solitary dominion, and we're living under the limits stipulated by Magna Carta 1215, which means no limits on individual freedom, but very strict limits on the actions of government officials. What do you suppose would be the inevitable result if those officials began to overstep their limits and claim privileges which were unlawful, and no one, or only a tiny handful of the law-abiding, said or did anything to oppose such deeds. Wouldn't the end result, after a while, be exactly what we have today, complete with another set of Epstein File miscreants? Of course it would. There is no evading our responsibility or duty of upholding the law. Not in nature. And nature is where we live. Thinking that natural law can be successfully evaded is the kernel of stupidity that exists in the heart of every criminal enterprise, be it individual or group in nature. I'm sorry if what I'm about to say causes you to feel uncomfortable, even outraged, but facts are facts, and ignorance of the law is no excuse. So, if you are one of those who has not yet either learned or chosen to act in upholding the law as specified in Article 61 of Magna Carta 1215, you are indeed complicit in the debauchery and criminality that the Epstein Files expose so horrifically. You can change that if you want, but until you do, that remains your role. Thank you for watching.